So let's add to this logic of our rotating cube script, and let's make it dependent on user input. So I mentioned earlier that Playmaker is this concept of a state machine. And the idea of a state machine, the real power from a state machine, comes between switching states. And currently, our rotate state only has one state, or our rotate state machine only has one state, and it does its thing. It's been told to rotate. Okay, so we know that our cube is rotating. Now, I want to reconfigure, re-engineer this state machine without deleting my cube. I spent so much time, a lot of hard work creating my game object that I don't want to lose it. If I want to get rid of a state machine that's attached to an object, I can just right-click. I prefer to right-click on the start state and choose to remove FSM component. Okay, and once I remove that component, there's no longer a state machine. Now we can have multiple state machines on the same object, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, I'm just going to right-click and choose to add a state machine. So I have a default state machine. It has one state. Now this time around, I'm going to have a multiple state machine. I'm going to switch from state 1 to state 2. Now, when it comes to creating a state with multiple states, we kind of have this chicken and an egg situation where we have a couple of different options of what we want to create first. I'm going to start with the logic first. So start with the actions that are going to drive the events here. I'm going to start with state 1, and my goal is that when I press the space bar, I want to start the cube rotating. So the cube's going to be still until I get user input, in this case the space bar, which will cause the cube to start rotating. So what I'm going to do is on state 1, I'm going to go to my actions browser and I'm listening for some user input. So I'm going to go to the input category, and from input we can listen to this is all user input here. And what I'm listening for is a get key down. Okay, so I'm in the input category of my action browser. I'm looking for a get key down. And it gives you way down at the bottom of the screen of the action browser, it will give you a preview of what that state, what that action is doing. I'm going to double click and I'll add that action to state 1. And what this is saying is get key down. There's a key field, say, okay, well, what key are we listening for? I'm going to click on this drop down menu and you'll see that the entire keyboard is mapped here along with some other stuff. We have all of these options for user input, and we're listening for the space. So about 7 or 8 items down, there's the space. I'm going to choose that, and that is going to be the event that this is the keyboard input that's being listened that's going to fire a send event. Now, when it comes to state machines, the way that we transition from one state to another state is based on a send event. Okay. Now, send events, we can think of these as kind of, think of these as road signs. These are the things that kind of direct traffic based on what kind of input we're getting either from the user or from the game, and we direct traffic accordingly. Now, if I click on this drop-down menu, you can see that it says, well, we don't have any send events to choose from. Okay, and this is probably the most abstract thing when it comes to creating state machines in Playmaker, is the fact that we need to define our own events. And I'm going to do that by going to the Events tab. And down in the Events tab, I'm going to write the name of an event that I want to create. And in this case, this is just a user-friendly name. I'm going to call this Start Spinning. And I'll hit Return. And once I hit Return, you can see that I now, in my events list, I have an event called Start Spinning. Now, if I go back to my state machine, or my state tab, excuse me, and I go to the send event, now when I click on this drop-down menu, I have a choice of none or start spinning. Okay, now once I do that, Playmaker scolds me and says, well, wait a second, this event is not used by the state or any global transition. This is just a little error that's popping up saying we need a little bit more information. Okay, and the kind of information that we need is that we need to pass this state over to another state. So we need two things. The first thing that we need is that we need another state. And I can create another state by right-clicking anywhere in this gray space of the Playmaker editor and choosing to add state. Now, once I add state, I now have state 2, and state 2 I can click and drag around. State 2 is not attached to state 1. The current setup of the state machine is that we start and we enter state 1. Inside state 1, we're listening for a get key down. The key that we're specifically listening for is the spacebar, and when we press the spacebar, we fire off a send event. Now, when it comes to send events, we're talking about transition events, and we need to manually add a transition event from one state to the other. And the way that we do this is we right-click on a state, and we choose to add a transition event. And from our transition event lists, we have any event that we've created should be available here in this Add Transitions menu, along with system events and custom and network events. Now, we're going to avoid this finished and custom and system and network event and just choose the events that we've created. I'm going to choose the start spinning event. And once we do that, now you can see that on state 1, we have a transition event. That transition event currently is said start spinning. Once we have a transition event, what we can do is we can click and drag and wire that event to another state. So I'm just clicking and dragging, and we get this wire, and we'll attach that to state 2. Okay, so here's the logic, and I'm going to repeat this process, but here's the logic that we've set up so far. We've created a state machine, and from state 1, we've added an action that is get key down. We've chosen from our get key down, our key list, to listen specifically for the spacebar. When we press the spacebar, we've told this action to fire a send event that's called start spinning. We had created that start spinning event in the events tab. We chose the start spinning event from this action. We right-clicked and added this as a transition event so that we could wire one state to another. Okay, now I'm going to rebuild that whole process from the ground up, but right now we can test our logic. And by testing our logic, we can determine when we hit the play button, we can see that our state machine currently is stuck in state 1, okay, because it's listening for a get key down. And if it hears the spacebar being pressed, it's going to use the send event from this state to pass to whatever state we have it wired to. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to tap the spacebar, and when I do, watch what happens down here in the Playmaker editor. I tap the spacebar, I jump, okay, and I jump because my first-person controller is wired to jump when I hit the spacebar. But in addition to that, you can see that we transition from state 1 to state 2. Okay, now nothing's happening with the cube yet, but we'll approach that here in just a minute. So let me review this process. I'm going to toggle the play button, Command P. That takes me back out. I'm going to rebuild this state machine from the ground up really quickly, and I'll talk about some of the finer points. I'm going to right-click on the start state and choose to remove that state machine. Now remember, I have the cube selected. My goal is to build a two-state state machine that listens for button input that causes, when that button is pressed, we're going to cause our cube to rotate. So here it goes. I have my cube selected. I'm going to right-click and add a state machine. My state machine currently has one state. By design, I need a second state. So let me add that now. So now I have two different states. I'm going to name these states more appropriately. You can leave yours state 1 or state 2, but we'll make some notes here. This is my idle state. My first state, nothing's going to be happening. Everything's just going to be kind of sitting and waiting for something to happen. My state 2, this is going to be my spinning state or my rotate state. I'm not going to call it rotate because rotate is a command I'm going to use, an action that I'm going to use, and I don't want to confuse myself with what's going on here in the state machine, in the state machine labels. So my idle state, this is the place where I'm listening for some user input. I'm going to go to the action browser. I'm going to find the input category, and I'm listening for get key down. Now there's get key, there's get key down and get key up, and the difference is that get key down listens for when a certain key is pressed in the down position. The up key, the get key up, will listen for when a key is released. So it's a slight difference, but it'll affect the input in very different ways, and we'll use both of these. I'm going to double click to add a get key down, and this time around I'm going to listen for the S key. So I'm just going to scroll down. You can choose whatever key you want to listen for. But in this case, I'm going to listen for the S key. Okay, so when I press the S, I want my cube to start spinning. Now, I need to have a transition event that transitions from one state to another based on the result of this user input. Now remember, I don't have a transition event at this point. Okay, so if I were to right-click and add a transition event, the only event that I can choose from is a custom finished event, which is not what we want to use. Okay, so I'm going to go to my Events tab, and I'm going to create an event. And I'm going to call this event, this is just a user-friendly name. Again, we can kind of think of this as like directing traffic or road signs. This is just a user-friendly label that's going to be an indicator of how we're transitioning out of the state. So I'm going to say start spinning. And I'll put a little typo in there so we can modify that here in just a minute. So I have an event, it's called start spinning. I'm going to go to my state tab. Now I have a situation here. And my situation is that I could click on this drop-down menu and choose to add that as a send event. But I also need to add this as a transition event from this idle state. And I can do either one. As long as they're both done, I'll right-click and add the start spinning. Now I have that set as a transition event. And the moment I have that set as a transition event, we can assign an action to it. So as long as I have the send event indicated here inside this action, and the event is listed on my current state, the only thing left to do is to wire this over. Now, once I wire this over, you'll notice that this little exclamation point goes away. So I'll just wire that over. So my little warning goes away and says, okay, we have all the information that we need. We have an action. The action is listening for some keyboard input. When that keyboard input is received, it fires a send event that we've chosen from this list. That send event is represented in this state, and we've directed our traffic over here. Okay. Now, there's going to come a time when we have multiple events, and we have multiple events exiting the same state. So we're listening for different kinds of user input or different input from the game. So this might feel a little abstract and feel a little redundant if we're doing these things, but we have a really simple state machine, right? We're listening for keyboard input. Now we can test this. I'm going to hit the play button, and I'm paying attention to what's going on down here. And really the only thing I can test for right now is, am I staying in my idle state? Yes, and I'm staying there until I press the S key. And when I hit the S key, you can see that it passes from the idle state to the spinning state. Now my S key is mapped to back up, so I should have chosen a different key. I should choose a key that is not being used here. So let me toggle the play button. I'm going to go back in here, and I'm going to listen for a different key. Let me listen for T. Okay, I'll just use T to start spinning. T is kind of an arbitrary choice. Now, I've noticed that I made a typo in my send event. So let's go back and change that. I'm going to go into my Events tab. I'm going to select my send event, and down here in the event name, I'm just going to rename this. I'll call it start spinning. I'll fix that typo, and I'll hit return. And when I do, Playmaker scans and updates that for me. Okay, so I can change these send events on the fly. Even after they're wired, I can change the state names. It's highly modifiable, very user-friendly. So currently I'm listening for the T key, which passes to this event. So I'll test it one last time. I'll hit the play button. It's going to be so important that we test over and over. I'm going to hit the T key, and you can see that I'm now in the spinning state. So let's take our spinning state and do that same rotate command that we did in the previous presentation. So I'm going to go with my second state selected. I'm going to go to my transform category, and inside transform I'm going to find rotate, and I'll either double click or drag this rotate command into my spinning state. I want to rotate along the Y, so I'll toggle that variable button, which gives me the ability to key in a Y value, and I'll just type in 25 per second every frame. I'm not going to worry about fixed update or late update. Now when I hit the play button, I have something I can test. Okay, I could test the logic before because I had, the state machine set up. Now when I hit the T button, it transitions to another state, and in that second state, we have our spinning cube. Okay, so that's kind of the core logic of setting up a Playmaker state machine. Now I'm going to review that process one last time very quickly, and I'm going to modify this a little bit so that when I release the T key, it stops spinning. And so the idea is when I press and hold the T key, I'll cause that cube to rotate. When I release the T key, when I release it, it'll stop spinning. So just a slight modification to the logic that we already have. But I'm going to take this as an opportunity to rebuild this logic from the ground up. So I just right-clicked on the start state, choose to remove component, and just make a mental note that there is no state machine on this object. I can tell a couple different ways. I'm going to select the cube. I'm going to right-click and add a state machine. It's worth pointing out that if I don't have any information in my Playmaker editor, that means that I either don't have the object selected. So you'll notice that when I deselect my cube, there's no information down here in the Playmaker editor. That's because this information down here is contextually sensitive. It's object-oriented. When I click on my cube or any other object that has a state machine on it, that is the object which is going to populate this interface with state machine information. Okay, so if I deselect, nothing's here. But if I look up here and I see the cube, there's a little icon. That's one indicator that I have a state machine on it. If I select that cube, now I see that state machine. Okay, so let me set up this logic very quickly. I have state 1, and inside state 1, I'm listening for some user input. I'm listening specifically for a get key down, and the key that I'm listening for, in this case, I'll just use that T key again. I'm listening for the T key, and when I press the T key, I want to transition from state 1 to another state. So I got a few things that I need to solve here. I need to set up a transition event. I need to add that transition event to state 1, and I need to wire that to state 2. So let me get started here with adding another state. I'll go back to state 1, go to the Events tab. I'll say this is my transition event, just to demonstrate that I can name this any user-friendly name. Now, that's not always the case with things in Playmaker, but as far as the events go, we can name that whatever we want. I'll go back to my state. I'm going to right-click and add, this is my transition event, and I'll wire that over to state 2. I'll go back to state 1. Now, I have not entered this as a send event, and I'm going to leave that because that's going to be a little error here. I'm going to go to state 2, and I'm going to go to transform, and from transform I'm going to choose rotate, double click, and I'm looking to rotate along the Y. This time I'll say 20 per second. So now I have a bug. I have an error in my state machine. Let's see if we can squash this bug. I'm going to hit the play button, and I'm listening for the T key, but when I press the T key, and I'm pressing it right now, I'm not transitioning from state 1 to state 2. And the reason I'm not transitioning is even though I'm listening to get key down, a send event has not been identified to send this event. So if I go to state 1, I need whatever this transition event that is wired over to state 2, this key needs to reference that. So this is my transition event. This state, this is the spinning state. And this is spinning on Y, okay? So we're spinning on Y. Now I just added spinning on Y because I wanted to demonstrate this idea that in fact, if I change this to Y, now when I press the play button, I'll test this. If I press the Y button, it starts to spin on Y, okay? Now, I'll toggle the play button. Now, if I wanted to, I could go into state 1, I could listen for some additional input, and I could get key down, add another get key down, and listen, in this case, for the X key. Okay, and if I'm listening to X, I'll go back to my event system and say, let's say rotate on X as an event. Okay. I remember my first transition event says this is my transition event, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if I add another state, and this state is rotating on X, okay, I'm just naming that. I don't really need to name this so thoroughly, but if I go to my transform event and I look for rotate, I'm going to add another rotate to this state. This time I'm going to rotate this according to X 20. right? So I have two different states. I have one state that spins on Y. I have one state that spins on X. If I go back to state 1, I have one action that's get key down, listening for the Y key. If that's pressed, it goes, this is my transition event. If I get another key down, I'm listening for X this time. If I fire off the rotate on X event, now if I add that as a transition, you see that I now have two transition events from state 1. I'll wire that second event over to rotating on another axis. So now I have options. From state 1, I can make a choice. I can press Y or I can press X, and I should get the result that I want. So I'll press the play button. I'm looking at my cube. When I press the X button, it starts to rotate on X. Now I don't have any way to get back from these states back to state 1 right now. Okay, I could build that in a couple of different ways. Okay, on these states, I could wait a certain amount of time, and when I'm done waiting, I could pass that back to state 1, or I could listen for another key press. Okay, there's a lot of different options, and I'll just wire one of these, and at this point, I'm just kind of experimenting. I'm familiarizing myself with Playmaker. Okay, and so let's go back and look at our input. And if I were to, say, choose something like get any key, and if any key were pressed, you can see that I have a send event here. Okay, now I have 3 send events. There's no reason I couldn't use one of these send events and add it to this state to transition back, but I'm going to create one more send event, and I'm going to call this reset. I'll go back to my state tab because that's where most of the magic is going to happen here. And on any key press, when I'm in the X state, the rotating X, I want this to reset. So I'll right click and add that reset as a transition and wire that back home. Now, I have a bug, not a bug really, just kind of a glitch in my logic, in that from state 1, I can press either the Y or the X key. But if I go to Y, I'm stuck in Y because it's only kind of a one-way wiring system, right? I don't have any plan to recover and get back to state 1. From state 1, if I go to X, I can press any key and go back home. So let me try this. I'm going to press the play button. If I tap X, I'm rotating. I can see that I'm in rotate on X state. And now if everything works, I should be able to hit any key, which I hit any key, and it sent me back to state 1. Now when I press the Y key, I'm rotating in Y, but now I'm stuck here because I have not resolved this state. Spinning X, spinning Y does not resolve because its only job is to rotate. Okay, so I'll just do that same thing. I'll do any key. I'm going to reuse my reset event. It makes sense because its job is just to kind of go back home. So I'll right click, add transition, add that as an event, and wire that back home. Now I got a pretty solid logic. If I'm looking at my game, I can press the Y key, start to rotate my cube along Y. I can press that same Y key and it kind of works like a toggle now because it's really listening for any key. Now if I press X, it'll rotate on X, and I'll toggle that button again. So play around with this example. Try to create the rotating cube based on this logic. And in the next presentation, we'll take a deeper dive into Playmaker, and I'll add a little bit of nuance to this and point out a couple of tips and tricks when it comes to Playmaker. But for now, that should get us up and running in Playmaker. We'll use Playmaker to create a really simple pickup system to where we're picking up things that will contribute to health, pick up things that might harm us if we pick them up, that might add to a time limit that gives us more time to explore our island. But we'll start to make that transition into specific game mechanics in the next presentation.